This is my hobby, the greatest hobby. Hello everyone, Hobbyist here. We are back at it again with our Talisman character exploration guide. And previously, we had concluded the Angelic Celestial and how well he plays inside of the Harbinger expansion. If you haven't yet already, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button and to hit that bell icon because I'm going to be posting this Talisman content every single Tuesday. And I want to be able to enhance your gaming experiences better. Otherwise, let's go ahead and get into the next character. This will be the section where I go into the lore, but when it comes to this next character, there isn't really much to be found on her. But I will say, when it comes to the Ascendant Divines, she is probably one of the most confusing to a lot of new players when it comes to understanding her abilities. But before we get further into that, let's go ahead and show you the stat card here, see what she's all about. So the Ascendant Divine has a strength of 3 and a craft of 3, so it's a very balanced character. And as we can see here down at the bottom, see that crow logo? That is the symbol of the Harbinger expansion. Any of the particular components that are a part of the Harbinger expansion are going to bear that crow logo, so it makes things easier for you when it comes to separating it from the rest of your Talisman adventures. If you want to learn more about the Harbinger expansion, I've got a video on it right up top here. So definitely go and check that out if you haven't already. But moving forward with the rest of the Ascendant Divine and her character card, you can see that she's got Fate of 3, an average life of 4, she's a neutral character, and is the only other character in Talisman who starts inside the temple. When it comes to the Harbinger expansion, and when you're just thinking about from a position standpoint alone, this doesn't really provide any strategic benefits, because the Harbinger expansion is so exclusive to itself that you don't even really need to have any other expansions per se. It's NPC driven with its own set of mechanics, much like the Reaper and the Werewolf expansions have. But let me now transition from that point to going into the 4 character abilities and to really try and break this down. I will say this before I get into it, that some of these abilities might be up to interpretation, and there is a very high likelihood that I could be wrong. If so, please let me know down in the comments below. But first, it says you begin the game with 4 spells face down on your character card. These spells are your divine gifts. Your divine gifts do not count as spells for the purposes of other effects and do not count against your spell limit. Okay, so it's basically having spells without having spells. That makes any sense? So in practice, let me go ahead and show you what this is looking like so far. Now, if you don't have one of these are one of the Talisman placeholders that I have that I use for most of my character cards and whenever I play Talisman. It's something that you can get cheap on eBay and is probably the easiest way that it comes to organizing everything. Just to show you guys a little bit, this is where the card sits. This little tray here is where you can put all your gold. Your life counters go right here. Your strength counters, the reason that there's 3 pegs is that you stack them up on each individual one. And then when you get to 5, place the big 5 counter and then you move on to the next one. Same with your craft area. Up here is your base 4 cards that you can carry that are normally. Any trinkets or extra loot that you have can all go in this slot here, a little extension. On this opposite side, this is where your followers can go. They can all be placed up here. Then, over here, on this extension piece right here, is where you can have your mule or anything that extends your carrying limit up top, and then the rest of those extended items go in there. Where these bottom 5 knocks are is where your fate would go. Over here in this slot is where you can stack up all your trophies, and over here is where you can stack up all your spells. The reason that I tell you this is to further elaborate on the difference between your divine gifts and your spells. So, it says that we start with 4 divine gifts, so I just take the top 4 spells and just put them on top of the card. And they are not counting as your spells that you're going to use. Because of the 3 spells that you would carry, to make things easier and to differentiate, would go in this slot right here. Hopefully this makes things a little easier for you guys when it comes to bringing this ability to life. You've seen what this first ability looks like in practice. Let's go ahead and get onto the second character ability, the Ascendant Divine, which says, whenever you gain Strength or Craft and have 4 or fewer Divine Gifts on your character card, take the top card of the spell deck and add it to the Divine Gifts on your character card. So, the main difference when it comes to this second ability is that as you're gaining stats, you can gain Divine Gifts. And then you can have an unlimited number of Divine Gifts. These are spells that can't be taken away. So if you're facing the Arcane Scion inside of the Cataclysm expansion, then these Divine Gifts are very much so protected in comparison to any other spells that you would normally carry. So the way that simply breaks down is that, like I said, it's based on your stat build. Whenever you gain a strength or gain a craft, and you have 4 or fewer, because you always start with 4, then you can gain a 5th Divine Gift, or a 6th, so on and so forth, as you're assembling those. But then we go into this third character ability, and this is where things start to become a little interesting. It says, once per round you may cast one of your Divine Gifts as if it were a spell, though it does not count as a spell for the purpose of other effects. It does not count towards the maximum number of spells you may cast during a turn. Therefore, in essence, in order to break that down, these are spells that you can constantly cast, and generally you can only cast maybe 1 to 2 spells per turn for every other character in Talisman. But for the Ascendant Divine, you can cast an unlimited number of Divine Gifts as you see fit. And for any other purposes, you know how we said in the past how the Prophetess and the Spy are the only 2 characters who can look at spells? Well, because the Divine Gifts don't count as spells in any other circumstance, the Prophetess and the Spy cannot look at them. Meaning, these are spells that you can keep to your chest that they don't have access to. It's honestly pretty good, because then, when you get to 5, 6, 7, 8, where you start increasing the number of Divine Gifts that you have, then you can look at all of those and decide for yourself, which Divine Gifts am I going to use? Are they going to benefit me? Would it better benefit terrain, or would it better to sabotage other players in order to allow yourself to pull ahead? Honestly, it's pretty good. But then, this is where the fourth ability starts to get a little bit more interesting, because it says, at the start of your turn, you may discard one of your Divine Gifts to draw 1 spell. But we already got Divine Gifts for free, so why would we need to exchange some of those for another spell? Well, here's, again, how it would look in practice. So back with our Ascendant Divine example that we've got right here, these are our 4 Divine Gifts that we have here. These are our spells that don't necessarily count as spells. These are the things that we can use. So just to give you guys an example, if any of these 4 were something that we're not particularly interested in, and we're trying to get something better, let's say we discard this Sacred Offering. We get rid of it. Then, at that point, we could draw a new spell, but because it is a spell and not a Divine Gift, this is going to go here. So maybe you are able to exchange your spells in comparison to any other character. You can get rid of the Divine Gifts that aren't going to be able to help you, and essentially you have your own unlimited pool of spells. Therefore, it creates an interesting dynamic, because unlike spellcasters before, where you would get a spell, you either use it and then maybe cycle and get another one, you can essentially increase the unlimited number of spells that you are able to possess through your Divine Gifts. Like I said, every time that you're gaining a strength and a craft, you're gaining a divine gift. If that divine gift isn't very useful to you, then you can simply discard it and get a spell. Honestly, it's a pretty good ability to have. The process of having divine gifts, and the fact that these divine gifts can be converted into spells that could possibly be more beneficial to you, and the fact that you can have an unlimited number of divine gifts in order to give yourself an unlimited number of spells. How does this look in practice in comparison to the rest of the Harbinger expansion? Because you gotta remember, we've got 4 different themes of Omens, each of which operate on a different capacity. The first Omen set that we're gonna cover is the Shattered World. If you guys wanna pause the video and take some time to read this prophecy flavor text, you are more than welcome to do so. Alrighty, so the Shattered World is entirely themed around the change in the terrain. So, how does this play into the Ascendant Divine and her abilities? Well, we get to the first Omen. It simply states, each character places 1 random terrain card on a space. That terrain card is always going to vary, especially considering how inside of 10 of these, we've got a various assortment of options that could very well appear at any given time. So it makes things a little bit unpredictable as far as how difficult this is going to be. But otherwise, it's not going to be too harmful, nor does it really influence how you're going to operate within your spell parameters. Then we get to the second Omen, which is the character rolls a 1 for his move. He places 1 random terrain card on his space. He must then stay on his space and encounter it instead of moving normally. So again, this isn't something that's too bad, because even though the terrain is changing and spaces may become more or less available, this doesn't do too much as far as harming you. Now, if you consider any other expansions that contain terrain cards, like the Firelands expansion, the Cataclysm expansion, those sets of terrain cards could also play a role in how easy or how difficult it is going to be in various locations, in what it is that's being cut off. Because the Ascendant Divine's divine gifts abilities and how it can translate into spells doesn't have to be influenced by any other specific space locations, it's looking pretty good so far. Then we go to this third Omen ability, which is discard all face-up adventure cards in all regions. If a character is on a space with a face-up adventure card, he loses 1 life for each card on his space discarded in this way. So this could prove to be very difficult if you happen to be on the spaces that you need to be in order to gain those strength and craft points from trophy conversions. Because if you remember back in the character card, it's whenever we gain a strength or a craft, we can gain more divine gifts. So if we're losing lives from the multiple enemies, the multiple spirits that we have, things are a little bit more difficult. But with every Omen set, it's always going to be from Omen 4 through 7 to where things really start to become a challenge. Because Omen number 4 says, whenever a character lands on a space with a terrain card, he places 1 random terrain card in the closest space which does not have a terrain card. If 2 spaces are equally close, that character chooses. So essentially, now terrain cards are starting to spread. You're always going to have a terrain card on the space that you have, and then it's going to be adjacent. You're going to see spaces beside you. If you're cutting off the city, the chapel, the graveyard, the village, or the tavern, then it could prove to be difficult. But it's not really affecting us still, because we have our own divine gifts. We're still finding enemies. We're still possibly beating them, and then turning those into points which we can use for divine gifts. And if those divine gifts aren't any good, we trade in those divine gifts and give ourselves spells. So we're still very much in the clear. Then we get to Omen number 5, which says, Place one random terrain card on a tavern, village, graveyard, chapel, city, temple, and castle. So all of the main starting locations are now gone. It's a little rough for any of the other characters who gain benefits from those particular locations, but from the Ascendant Divine, this still really doesn't affect us in our character abilities. From an overall game point, obviously we should be concerned. We're on Omen number 5, we only have 2 more to go before the game becomes over, but this doesn't really play into our abilities because we're still doing our own thing. The terrain doesn't affect us. Then we get to Omen number 6. If a character ends his turn, on a space with a terrain card, he loses a life. So, again, this really isn't playing any influence into how we operate with the Ascendant Divine. Obviously, we're still getting very much closer towards the end of the game, but this doesn't really affect us. Then we get to Omen number 7. Replace the text of each space not in the inner region or containing a terrain card with lose 1 life and draw 1 card. Do not draw a card if there is already one in this space. If you've managed to gain all your stats and to get as many divine gifts as spells as you need, then maybe you might be able to get those healing spells in order to boost your longevity. Or if you're already in the inner region, which I'm hoping that you have developed to the point where you are already in the inner region, this doesn't affect you. But then, of course, if we get past that, it's game over, regardless of abilities. So overall, inside of just the Shattered World set of omens, nothing is really affecting us. Because we have every capability to control what we need to do to where the omens aren't going to affect us. So now the next omen set that we're going to be covering is the Stars Align. So I'll give you guys some time to take a look at this here and to maybe pause the video if you want to read this flavor text to kind of immerse yourself inside of the themes of this particular omen set. So this omen set is very much themed around the death of magic. And I do believe that this particular set of omens is going to affect us more so than any of the other omens that are going to come after this one. So when we get to the first omen, you can see that spell limit of each character is increased by 1. Each character gains 1 spell if his craft allows. Again, it's not bad. So far, with just this first omen alone, it's nice to have an increase to where we can carry 2 spells, but we can already carry an unlimited number of divine gifts to use the spells if needed. So, it kind of seems as an unnecessary use at this point. So now we go on to the second omen. Spell limit of each character is increased by 1, so now we're carrying 3 spells, which we could already do if we had been playing our cards right and boosting our stats, and then each character gains its complement of spells. So then, ideally at this point, we already have our 4 divine gifts, and then we have 3 spells. If nothing out of any of those is good, then we can just get rid of one of the divine gifts, get a spell. Any of the spells that we're currently carrying aren't good, because we can't carry more than 3 spells up until this point, then we can simply discard it and then just use the new spell. So again, this second omen is kind of redundant. When we get the third omen, we managed to get this far. It's increased by 2. So now, instead of carrying 3 spells, we can maybe carry 5 spells at a time. After a character casts a spell, he immediately gains 1 spell if his craft allows. So essentially, making everybody a spell cycler. Well, we can already do that with our own abilities. So again, this ability is pretty redundant for as far as affecting us. And then for this fourth omen, the spell limit of each character is increased by 2. So now we can carry 7 spells. Whoever character casts a spell, he must either lose 1 life or 1 fate. this Omen, again, amazingly doesn't affect us. Because if we're casting Divine Gifts, if we're gaining the stats that we need in order to get Divine Gifts, then the Divine Gifts don't count as spells, therefore we don't have to suffer that consequence. Otherwise, for everyone else, this is a turning point where things are starting to become more difficult. So, this is working out very well in our favor as the Ascendant Divine. Then we get to the 5th Omen. Spell limit of each character is increased by 1, so now we're carrying 6 or 7 spells, all things considered. Each character must lose 1 life for each of his spells, then discard all of his spells. Well, maybe if we had gotten that far, if we had already casted all of our spells, and we only had Divine Gifts left, we don't have to worry about this ability at all. Because even though we have an increased limit now, we don't have any spells, we can just use the Divine Gifts as we need to. And if we're trying to get more Divine Gifts, we just, again, look for other enemies, try to take them out, turn those trophies in, gain more points, and gain Divine Gifts at the same time. Then we get to the 6th Omen, which is spell limit is reduced by 1, so now we're down to 6 or 5 that we can carry, and then only have 1 magic object. Now, this could prove to be harmful if the weapons that we're using in order to gain our trophies is a magic object. But if you've only been spending it on weapons or anything that does with strength, then that works in your favor too. Because you don't have to worry about a carrying limit when it comes to that. And then we get to the 7th Omen, to where characters cannot gain spells or have magic objects, treat all spaces in the inner region except for the plane of peril and the crown of command as blank. Each character discards all of his spells and magic objects. Again, this still doesn't affect us at all, because our Divine Gifts get past that barrier. If we had any spells that we've gained from sacrificing our Divine Gifts in exchange for, then that does suck. But as we're building stats, if we're still constantly building stats, then we don't need to worry about it, because then we'll just get Divine Gifts where we can use as spells without technically being spells. So this is just a second Omen set that the Ascendant Divine just gets past using just her abilities alone. It's honestly just insane at how versatile the Ascendant Divine really is. But now let's get on to the next set of Omens. So this is the next Omen set that we're going to be covering, Armeggedon. So obviously with Armeggedon, the theme of this entire set of Omens is the end of the world. And if you're particularly interested in reading this flavor text to get yourself immersed, go ahead and take the time to read this and maybe even pause the video. Okay, so when it comes to a particular set of Omens, it's pretty interesting. So let's go ahead and get into that first Omen and see how much it plays a role inside the Ascendant Divine. So, this one says, each character in the same region as the Harbinger must lose 1 fate. Whenever a character defeats another character, he may replenish 1 fate. So, this doesn't really play a role into us. Again, we have our Divine Gifts that we can use to exchange for spells, and then we can either cast our Divine Gifts or the spells that we already carry. So, again, this really doesn't play a role into how we're affected. Then we got Omen number 2. Each character in the same region as the Harbinger must lose 1 life. Whenever a character defeats another character, he may heal 1 life. Even though this sucks initially, again, this doesn't really play a role into affecting us at all. Then we get to Omen number 3. Discard all adventure cards in the same region as a Harbinger and draw 1 Harbinger card to replace each discarded card. Whenever a character is defeated by another character, you must lose 1 life. So this just essentially makes battles seem a little bit more difficult. And with this first line of text, this could become a problem. more so on the grand scheme of the game and not so much for our personal character growth. Because replacing these cards with Harbinger cards could mean that more Omens are going to be discarded, because there are events and signs that are going to further unveil these particular events. So that's where things can become a problem. But otherwise, it doesn't really play a role with us. Then we get to Omen number 4. Each character in the same region as the Harbinger must lose either 1 strength or 1 craft. Whenever a character defeats another character, he may gain 1 strength and craft. So, this Omen is the most beneficial to us as the Ascendant Divine, because our whole theme and our whole premise is to gain stats in order to increase our divine gift count. Therefore, if we have developed our stats, or if we've got the right weapons, this would be the perfect opportunity for you to start going after players when you otherwise wouldn't. Then we get to Omen number 5. Each character in the same region as the Harbinger must kill 1 follower at random. Whenever a character is defeated by another character, he must kill 1 of his followers. Because the Ascendant Divine isn't really dependent on followers or follower abilities, much to the dismay of any other characters in the past, it's really not gonna harm her. Again, this reoccurring pattern that we're seeing here is that even though the overall game is going to be affected because we're getting closer and closer to losing, the Ascendant Divine has already started to blow past 2 different sets of omens. It's honestly pretty great. Then we get to Omen number 6. Each character in the same region as the Harbinger must discard 1 object at random. Whenever a character is defeated by another character, he must discard 1 of its objects. Now, definitely this is going to suck if you got a plethora of good weapons that you're trying to use, because we are trying to use as many weapons and objects in order to build our own stats. Because again, we're trying to play into our own strengths here and use our divine gifts and spells and to be able to cycle between the 2. So that is something to keep in mind. If you're losing objects, you make that more difficult for you in order to achieve. Then, by the time we get to the 7th Omen, whenever a character is instructed to draw Avenger cards, he must draw Harbinger cards instead. Honestly, at that point, it's a very impossible game to win. It still doesn't play a role into how slighted that you're going to be as a character. But this is more so an external circumstance that really falls out of your control, which is what happens a lot inside this particular expansion. By the time you get to a certain point within the Omens, it's more so just trying to survive in comparison to just worrying about other characters or any other weaknesses that you otherwise didn't consider. So until we got to Omens 6 and 7, we really were in the clear with the Ascendant Divine, and especially within Omens 4 and 5, we saw that there was actually benefits for us in comparison to the hindrances that any of the other characters are going to have. So now we are into the last set of Omens inside of this expansion, the Rise of the Dead. And the Rise of the Dead is very much themed around the undead and spirits, and more so the spirits just coming back to life. So if you guys want to take a little bit of time, pause the video, and read this flavor text, you are more than welcome to. I find it very nice to read in order to immerse myself into this world. But now, let's go ahead and get into the first Omen. First Omen says, spirits and undead add 1 to their attack rolls. Increase the value of each spirit and undead trophy by 1. This plays very well into our favor because we are trying to develop our stats in order to gain gifts and in order to gain spells. So if our trophies are worth more, then it's easier to gain more craft and to carry more spells. So this particular Omen is very beneficial to us. Then we get to Omen number 2, which again, the spirits and undead add 1 to their attack rolls, and then whenever a character defeats a spirit or undead, you may draw the top 5 cards of the adventure deck and take 1 object of his choice. Discard the remaining cards. This is, again, something that is more beneficial to us rather than a hindrance, because we want those objects that are going to enable us to progress and eventually make it towards the end game. Then we get to Omen number 3, which says, spirits and undead add 1 to their rolls once more. So spirits in the undead, which undead is more so an enemy classification inside the Harbinger deck than it is inside anywhere else. And then discard the top 10 cards of each adventure deck. Then, starting with a character taking the current turn and moving clockwise, each character may take 1 follower or object of his choice from any discard pile. This opens the gates of opportunity for us if we're playing with more expansions, because the city deck, the highland deck, the woodland deck, and the dungeon deck are all considered adventure decks for their specific regions. Therefore, those would be cards that you would be discarding and you would have the opportunity to look through as well, because the Harbinger deck does not count as an adventure deck. The Draconic Lord decks do not count as adventure decks. Hence why the Prophet's ability doesn't work on these cards for exchanging it, or the Orb of Knowledge's ability doesn't work on changing these cards. So we're in the same premise here when it comes to this third Omen. Then we get to Omen number 4. Spirits and undead are adding 1 yet again to their attack rolls. Especially inside of the Blood Moon expansion, it becomes a bit more of a danger, especially if you already stacked 4 the attack score in addition to being at nighttime. Plus also considering how many spirits or undead that you're fighting at any particular point. So that is something else to keep in mind. Whenever a character defeats a spirit or undead in battle or second combat, you must discard it instead of taking it as a trophy. Now this is starting to become a problem, because our whole premise revolves around being able to gain those stats in order to use our more potent abilities. If we can't gain trophies from spirit or undead, then that starts to become a problem. Then we get to Omen number 5. Spirits and undead add 1 to their attack rolls once more. Then, whenever a character is instructed to draw adventure cards, you must draw 1 additional card at random from the discard pile. So this could be an issue when it comes to how powerful the enemies that we're going to be facing at one particular point, and the fact that we've gone through 5 omens and spirits or undead are adding 5 to their attack score, in addition to the day-night cycle. So this is where things can start to become even more difficult for us. And obviously, with us being at Omen number 6, this is where, from an overall game standpoint, that we are starting to get in a lot more trouble. Then, we get to Omen number 7. Treat all enemies as enemy undead. Undead add 2 to their attack rolls. Discard all face of strangers and followers in all regions, and take all enemies and all discard piles, shuffle them, and place them on top of their respective decks. So this is where it starts to become a problem, because now, instead of adding 5 or 6, now we've added 8, and every single enemy is going to add 8 to their attack score. And that's not even including how many of these enemy undeads that we're facing, or the day-night cycle inside of the Blood Moon expansion. So, this more so, when it comes to the Ascendant Divine, especially if enemies are strength-based, that we're put into a very impossible situation where it's very difficult to win. Even a strength 1 or a strength 3 character, or creature, more specifically, is going to be able to attack you with at least 11 or higher. So, that is very much a very difficult and a very nearly impossible situation to win, because at that point, you are already going to be doomed, essentially. So, when it comes to the Omen decks, I want to say that the Rise of the Dead is one where it is only more difficult, again, once you get towards the very end. And that is something that has been a pretty reoccurring pattern inside of the Ascendant Divine's kit. What I think of the Ascendant Divine overall, I think the fact that alone, she gets through 3 out of the 4 Omen decks, 2 of which only really start to hurt her towards the very end, Omens 5, 6, and 7, are pretty good. The fact that she can give herself an unlimited spell supply is absolutely phenomenal. I guess the only cons is that it's dependent on if she can develop stats. And the fact that she's very balanced means that she could be very vulnerable to strength or craft specialists. So, aside from that though, the Ascendant Divine is an outstanding character, and probably who I would consider one of the best characters in Talisman period, but at the top of my list when it comes to the 3 Harbinger characters by themselves. I thank you guys so much if you guys have been following this journey so far. If you don't know about this already, I've got a Talisman Discord server that I have started up, to where at any time at certain points, we might be able to get into a Talisman Digital Edition game. I would love to see you guys become a part of that. Otherwise, see you guys in the next one.